Okay, this is our second lesson for Old Testament survey. You remember last week we kind of surveyed the entire Old Testament, Genesis to Malachi, to see what the storyline was that ran through that. Of course, particularly from Genesis 12 forward, is largely God's dealing with the nation of Israel and his plan to redeem the whole world through that nation. We want to do one more overview this morning before we start looking at individual books. We'll start looking at Genesis next Sunday. But this morning we're just going to do an overview of the Pentateuch. Pentateuch is also known as the law. Remember the reference we looked at last week in Luke. Jesus divided the Old Testament into the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. The law, the prophets, and the writings is another way to think about that. We'll be looking at the law. It's also called the 5 scrolls of the Pentateuch. And again, our major objective in this class is certainly we'd love for you to learn more about the message of each individual Bible book, but we want you to learn the storyline of the Old Testament. That's really important. It's not a complicated storyline at all, but to me, if you end up with a better understanding of that after the class is over, we will have accomplished our purpose. So we are, by looking at the storyline of the Pentateuch, going to look at the storyline of each individual book. First is Genesis. And again, the first 11 chapters are marked by 4 key events. What are they? Isaiah?
The creation. The flood.
Okay, the flood, but what comes after creation? Fall, flood, and then what?
The ark.
The what?
Ark.
No, the ark was part of the flood. What's the other major event? Tower of Babel, scattering of the nations. So those are the 4 key events. And again, one of the things we want to try to do is help you just think about the big picture of each individual Bible book as well, so that you can think through what the outline of that book is on a large scale. You know, you can outline Bible books on a very large scale, and then you can go within those outlines and do them in more detail. But those are the 4 key events of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. You can see that covers a time span of approximately 2,000 years. We have even genealogies within the first 11 chapters that give us an idea of how long that time period was. Creation, of course, was made in 6 days by God. He created the heavens and the earth, the seas and all that's in them. The crown of that creation was man and woman, and he made man and woman to subdue the earth and to rule over it. Of course, he also gave them one prohibition in the garden, and that was that they could not eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They violated that command, and that led into the fall, into sin. If you think about it, the first 2 chapters of Genesis and the last 3 chapters of Revelation, the last 2 really, are the only sections of the Bible where we don't have people living under the sin and under the curse that came about as a result of sin. So the curse comes about in chapter 3. Things go downhill from there. Man gets only more and more wicked over time, to a point where we have this very striking statement in Genesis 6. God said that he was sorry that he had made man, because his only thoughts continually were those of wickedness. So because of that, he brings the flood. And even in the midst of that flood, he has somebody who's testifying to who he is and even warning them about this coming judgment. Who is that? Noah. Noah, the New Testament tells us he was a preacher of righteousness, but just by virtue of the fact that he was building this ark, it was a testimony to God's coming judgment. Remember, before the flood, it had not rained the first time. How was the earth watered before the flood?
Like the rivers and oceans.
Okay, the rivers and the oceans. What else does it tell us in Genesis 2?
Like mist.
That's right. The water would kind of come up out of the ground. More than just rivers and oceans. Those were there for sure, but the water, the garden was watered by a mist that rose up out of the earth. So there had been no rain before the flood. And you can imagine, because of that, when Noah warned about an impending flood, people weren't going to believe him. Look, it's never done what you're talking about. Why are you building this big boat out in the middle of the land? We don't believe you. And in fact, as it turned out, there were, only 8 people that believed Noah? Noah and his wife his 3 sons and their wives. And then, of course, Noah was responsible with God's bringing the animals into the ark to preserve those so that the earth could be repopulated after the flood. So that takes place in Genesis 6 through 9. And then 10 and 11 tells us about the confusion of the languages at the Tower of Babel and the way that God used that to ensure that the people would scatter. Remember what they were doing, instead of subduing the whole earth the way that God had commanded, they were gathering into one place. They were wanting to build this tower that would reach up into heaven. And the implication seems to be there that they were establishing their own religion. They were turning away from the true God and wanting to have this tower that would be also a center of worship of gods of their own making. All those 4 events provide the background for Genesis 12. Genesis 12 is a significant turning point in the book of Genesis. What happens there in the very first part of chapter 12?
The nations dispersed.
Say again. What'd you say?
Dispersed.
Well, they've already dispersed in 10 and 11. What happens in 12?
First time God messes heaven.
Okay, so God calls Abraham. He's going to call him out of the land that he's living and separate him from the rest of his family, and he's going to take him to a land that he will show him. He's going to make a great nation of him. So all that happens in chapter 12, and that really initiates the plan of redemption that runs through the rest of the Bible. So the last chapters of Genesis, from Genesis 12 all the way through Genesis 50, are marked by 4 key individuals. Think about the first 11 as 4 key events, the last 12 to 50, 4 key individuals. Who are they?
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and
Joseph. So Abraham, of course, is the one with whom God makes the covenant initially. It's confirmed to Isaac as Abraham's son. It's confirmed to Jacob as Isaac's son. It's confirmed to Joseph. And Joseph really is the one that ends up raised up to a position of power in the land of Egypt. And that's where the nation of Israel is going to end up. And that's where they end up multiplying. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. What would you say is a key concept that dominates the chapters of 12 through 50? The covenant itself, the Abrahamic covenant. I think that's what I have up there. So again, it's very beneficial that we've already studied the covenants for this class, because we're going to see that they're key. They provide the key structure for understanding the Old Testament. All right, so how does the book of Genesis end? Okay, so let's look there at the end of Genesis. Genesis 50, remember Joseph is down in Egypt. His brothers have had to come down before him to get food on multiple occasions because there's a famine in their land. He's not revealed his identity to them initially. These were the same brothers that sold him into slavery, and that's what ended up enabling Joseph to be in the place of power that he was in the land of Egypt. But ultimately, Joseph does reveal himself to them, and they're afraid that after their father dies, he's going to take vengeance upon them. Let's pick it up in Genesis 50, beginning in verse 19. Let's begin in verse 17. Thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers. This is the brothers talking, and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. So Joseph is not really turning out to be what they thought he might be. They thought he might want to take revenge on them. He didn't. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me. And they did mean evil against him when they sold him into slavery. But God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons, that was one of his sons, also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, who were born on Joseph's knees. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Remember, they're down in Egypt at this point, and Joseph has made provision for them to live there, but he knows that eventually God's going to bring them back up into the land of Canaan. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. That is, once they do go back to the land of Canaan, they will take Joseph's bones with them and bury him there. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. That's the end of the book of Genesis. And as you keep reading through, and this is the case with all 5 books, the next book picks up where the previous one left off. So that brings us to the book of Exodus.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Not really related to the overall, but is that just like a cultural thing that they wanted the bones to be, or?
Yes.
I wouldn't really think that it would matter where your bones are at.
I don't think it matters to us, and even today, like when soldiers die in war in foreign country, oftentimes we do try to bring their bodies back, but sometimes you can't. I think for them it was important. It was important for them both to be buried amongst their own ancestors, and I think in Joseph's case, he wanted to be in the land that God had promised to grant to his descendants. All right, so Exodus, the first 13 chapters, describe God's work through Moses to deliver Israel from Egyptian bondage. How does God do that? What specifically? What kind of miracles? What do we describe them as?
Judgments?
Okay, plagues. So the 10 plagues God brings, he brings them on the nation of Israel. What is his purpose in doing that? To demonstrate his power. It actually says that in a couple of places in Exodus. Pharaoh hardens his own heart in that he would say at some points, okay, I'll let you go, this is enough, and then he would change his mind. But it also says that God hardens his heart. And I think the reason he does that is he wants to bring more judgments upon Egypt. Remember, even back in the Abrahamic covenant, it said that God would judge Egypt and that they would come out with many possessions. And we read about that. That's exactly what happened in the Exodus. So what was the last plague? Passover, the death of the firstborn. God told Moses, and through him all the others, that they were to slay a lamb, to put the blood on the doorpost, and that would be a sign for the death angel to pass over their home and not kill the firstborn. Of course, they had to do that in faith, right? They had to believe what God said and do it in order to be protected. And they did. The Egyptians, of course, did not do that, and their firstborn were killed. And so finally, Pharaoh lets the people go. But even then, he changes his mind. And once they get out, they're pursued by Pharaoh and his armies. They're pinned against the Red Sea. God brings one more, well, not one more. He brings another supernatural miracle to destroy the Egyptian army and to free the people. That's 1 through 13. 14 through 18 is the journey from Egypt down to Mount Sinai. I won't say much about that right now, and we'll look at all of this in more detail as we go through each individual book, but I will show you on the map a little bit about that journey. 19 through 24 is the Mosaic Covenant, and again, we've talked a lot about that already, but those chapters spell out what God requires of Israel, what he obligates himself to do for them as far as being their God and he being their people. They're to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation before him. So 19 through 24 spells that out in detail. In 25 to 31, Moses receives instructions for the tabernacle and for the anointing of priests. So these are a lot of chapters to describe the construction of the tabernacle, how it was to be in great detail. And then the last part well, not the last, but in 32 to 34. And as a sign of things to come, Israel is not even out of Egypt good. They've seen all these supernatural works by God. And what do? They get tired of waiting on Moses to come down from the mountain. Even Aaron, as a spokesman for Moses and as his brother, helps the people in doing this. And it's interesting what they say when Moses does come down the mountain and confront them. They say, well, we didn't know what had happened to you. Aaron himself especially says, I threw this gold into the fire and out came this golden calf. It was like he was trying to not take any responsibility for it. But it was a terrible thing, especially in light of what God had done for them up to this point. And a number of men were slain that day because of their unfaithfulness to the Lord. The last part of Exodus describes the construction of the tabernacle. Now, this is going to be a key structure for the rest of the Old Testament. And subsequently is replaced by the temple, but the tabernacle is God's special dwelling place among the people. It contains the Ark of the Covenant, and the glory of the Lord rests upon that Ark. And as they're moving through the wilderness, it's only when that Shekinah glory tells them that they take up the tabernacle. It was very portable, and that was the job of the Levites, was to help transport it. It's only as the cloud moves by day or the pillar of fire by night that they move to a different location. So again, that's a broad outline of the book of Exodus. Exodus takes place, it starts out in Egypt. The setting changes down to Mount Sinai. Again, I'll show you a map that shows this better in just another slide. But Leviticus also takes place down at the base of Mount Sinai. So they're still in the same location. The first 7 chapters of Leviticus describe all these different offerings that are required of the people. And there are different kinds of offerings. Some are for sin, some are for thanksgiving, some are associated with different feasts that they do that recognize God's work of redemption. We'll look at those in more detail when we get to Leviticus. 8 through 10 again deals with the consecration and duties of the priest. Remember, the Levites were of the tribe of Levi. Not all of those were priests. They were a subset. They had to be a son of Aaron in order to be a priest. And these priests were particularly charged with the temple service. What the Levites did was help with that. They weren't all priests. They helped, for example, move the tabernacle when they had to move to another place. But the priests were a subdivision within the Levites. And they had to go through a process of being cleansed by blood. They had special garments they had to wear. Of course, the high priest went inside the Holy of Holies once a year to make atonement for the sins of the people. 11 through 22 are regulations concerning purity, atonement, and sanctification. Leviticus is very much a book about holiness. It very much instructs us about the holiness of God and this distinction between unclean and clean. Now, that wasn't always a sin issue. Can you think of some ways that made somebody unclean that wasn't necessarily sin? Okay, touching a dead person was one. That made you unclean, and you had to go through a ritual, a purification process to become clean again. Can you think of any others? Even having a baby, that's not sin, but it put a woman in a state of uncleanness. So the main thing that God's doing here is just teaching the fact that He is holy, and He's using these purification ceremonies to emphasize that, and to emphasize clean versus unclean. 23 through 25 describe the feast of Israel's calendar. Think about this. The Mosaic Covenant not only regulated all that they did as far as things that they could wear and couldn't wear, things that they could eat and couldn't eat. It regulated the way that they were to treat one another with all these various laws and stipulations. It also regulated their calendar. And what were the purpose of the feast of Israel? What did they typically do?
Kill animals.
Okay.
Cleanse.
So the Passover again involved the slaying of an animal, but what was the significance of these feasts?
To teach people about.
They They were a remembrance of what?
What God did for them.
Exactly. What God had done for them in their history. The Passover reminded them of the fact that they had been delivered from death and been protected from the Passover angel, and that was closely associated with them being brought out of Egypt. The unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, reminded them of the haste with which they left Egypt. What was another feast that they celebrated? Feast of Booths. And what would that remind them of? They built these homemade tents out in the wilderness because they were a wandering people at that point in time. So on the one hand, these feasts reminded them of what God had done in their history to redeem them, to make them His people, to protect them. But they also did something else, the feast. What were they tied with that was a very important part of Israel's life? The harvest, the agricultural cycle. You had feast, for example, you would have the feast of the first fruits, where they would raise up the first fruits of their harvest and recognize that these had come from God, and it was an anticipation of the fuller harvest. Well, those harvests only came as God provided rain and made the ground fertile and enabled them to reap these things. Of course, those were related to the covenant in the sense that was part of the promises of both the Abrahamic and the Mosaic covenant. All right, the last part of the book of Leviticus describes the blessings and the curses that were associated either with obedience or disobedience to the covenant. There were also vows and valuations on the last chapters. We looked at Leviticus quite a bit in our study on the covenants, Leviticus 26 that is, and how it was a summary of what would happen to Israel if they were faithful to the covenant on the one hand or disobedient to the covenant on the other. It also anticipated that if they disobeyed and they were scattered among the nations, then eventually one day God would restore them as a people. That, in summary, is the storyline of the Old Testament. It's God making this relationship with the nation of Israel, spelling out what would happen if they obeyed or disobeyed, anticipating that they will disobey and be scattered with the ultimate punishment being exiled from the land, and then ultimately restored by God's grace and through His enablement, especially in the New Covenant. That's what runs through Genesis to Malachi. All right, that brings us to Numbers. Why is Numbers called Numbers? It's full of numbers. It really starts out, again, this time it starts out at Sinai, and they ordered the people. By this time, the nation is well in excess of 2 million people. And they order them around the tabernacle by tribes. You can imagine what it was like without the modern convenience of a bullhorn to communicate to 2 million people. God was communicating to Moses, Moses was communicating to the people, and they had to be organized in order for that communication to pass to all the people that they needed it to. First 12 chapters describe the journey from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. I'll show you on that map what that involves. So Numbers is not only full of numbers and numbering the 12 tribes, it's also a book that's a travel log in essence. It's describing the journey up from Sinai to the Promised Land. 13 to 19 is Israel's wandering in the wilderness because of their sin, and I'll talk about that more in just a little bit. This generation is not going to get to come into the Promised Land. Instead, they'll die out in the wilderness, and a new generation will come in.
Can I ask a question quickly?
Yes.
Go back to the first one. You said there's 2 million people.
Yes.
Like, do they know like about how much space they had? And because I'm just thinking like Atlanta's like 3 million people, or it used to be. Like, how did you fit that many people in such a small area?
Well,
My picture is being small, but maybe it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean,
So I'm wondering, like, do they know like how much, when they would go to place, how much space they occupied?
So it's the nice thing is it's a wilderness area. I mean, it's a very large area geographically. The downside is there's virtually nothing in it to feed them, to sustain them, and that's why God has to provide manna for them. I don't think they were confined by space, because I think if you went there today, it's wide open spaces.
Yeah,
and
I
they
wasn't thinking confined by space, but just trying to figure out how you fit 2 million people in not fit them, but like I'm just wondering how close they were together.
Yeah.
I guess is my thing.
Yeah, and I would say on the one hand they were relatively close together, packed in, but it wasn't like, for example, I think about China as being a place full of people and not that huge in the cities in particular. They're living right on top of each other. At least here, even though it was a lot of people, they had room to spread out as they needed to. It seems like it would be advantageous for them to live relatively close together just to help each other. There's all kinds of logistics in this thing that we're not told completely about. For example, people are dying all through this 40-year wilderness, and what do they do about burying people? We're really not told much about that. There's sanitation issues with that many people. The good thing is that they are constantly on the move, but they also would camp at certain points and remain there for certain periods of time until God led them to another place. Again, I keep talking about this future map I'm going to show you. I hope it'll give you a better idea of just what that journey was like. It's incredible to think about that many people moving through the wilderness as far as they did, from Egypt down to Sinai and up to the Promised Land. Of course, it's a major part of Israel's history. All right, so then in the next chapters, 20 through 36, we'll see that they describe the movement from Kadesh Barnea, which is the place from which the spies were sent out around to the plains of Moab. And that brings us to the book of Deuteronomy. It's in the plains of Moab where they are when Moses writes that book and delivers those messages. Yes.
So is Kadesh Barnea the wilderness?
No, it's a particular location within the wilderness. So again, that map I think will make that more clear. All right, so that does bring us. Numbers is fairly easy to outline in a broad fashion. It just describes different legs of the journey.
I don't know if anybody said it, but it also showed God's power to keep all of those 2 million people in line to even go there.
That's right.
Together.
Yeah, certainly he's superintending that. He's providing for them in the wilderness because, there's just nothing out there. It's desert. So he has to provide manna from heaven. There are some oases that he enables people to stop at, but he also provides water out of the rock. It's a great way for God to demonstrate his care for the people. On the one hand, it's difficult. It's extremely difficult to travel through that part of the world. But on the other hand, God's providing for them. So it's a time of testing for the nation of Israel as to whether they'll believe God or not. It's also a time for him to demonstrate through very adverse circumstances that he cares for this people. All right, so Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy takes place in the plains of Moab, just east of the Jordan River, and it's a preparation for entering the Promised Land. Chapters 1 through 4 review their journey from Sinai to Moab. Chapters 5 through 26, Moses as one who's about to die. It's interesting how these books end with key leaders dying. But he's about to die and pass off the scene. Joshua's going to take his place. He uses this last opportunity he has to exhort the people to keep the law of God. And he basically recapitulates Exodus 19 through 24 and tells them and explains to them what the law requires. And then in 27 through 30, much like Leviticus 26, we have the promises of blessing for obedience, cursing for disobedience. Chapter 30 again anticipates that after all these things has come upon them and they've been scattered out amongst the Gentile nations, that God will restore them. He will circumcise their hearts and he will bring them back. And then chapters 31 to 34 is the final ministry of Moses. It's kind of a preparation for the mantle to be passed to Joshua. I had a blank there. And is anybody familiar with what's recorded in Genesis chapter 32?
Genesis?
I'm sorry, that's the wrong book. Deuteronomy 32.
That's a song?
Yes. It's the song that Moses teaches to the sons of Israel And it's not at all optimistic. It talks about what God has done for them, but it talks about how they've rebelled against Him. We've already seen that even within the first 5 books. And it really anticipates Israel's future failure to keep covenant with God. Moses dies in chapter 34, and that's the end of the first 5 books. Joshua, of course, picks up with the historical books. He's going to be the one that actually leads the people over into the promised land. Moses himself got to see it. He went up into Mount Nebo and looked over, but God prohibited him from entering the promised land because he too had not been obedient. He had struck the rock instead of speaking to it in the sight of the people. All right. This is a chart from Benware's book. We looked at this chart earlier in connection with our covenant study. The thing that I want to emphasize is that 4 of the 6 covenants that God makes with Abraham and his descendants, that's after the Noahic covenant, 4 of those 6 appear in the first 5 books of the Bible. So it gives you an idea of how foundational and how important these books are. They're really laying out the plan that's talked about in the rest of Scripture, at least the plan with Israel. We have the Abrahamic covenant. It's the most foundational of the other ones. The other ones pick up themes and elements of that and develop them. The Deuteronomic covenant is the whole book of Deuteronomy. It's renewal of the Mosaic covenant that's listed there with the new generation that's about to enter the promised land. The Davidic covenant is one of the covenants that's outside of the Pentateuch and made later with David and with his descendants. The new covenant is also outside. It shows up in the book of Deuteronomy and Ezekiel. What's the one covenant that's not on this chart that is also within the first 5 books? Priestly covenant. Numbers chapter 25. Remember, we studied that and saw that Phinehas and the descendants of Phinehas would always serve as priests to God. Again, we talked about how the sons of Zadok are those descendants, and they show up in Ezekiel in a context where it's describing the restoration of the temple and the restoration of Israel as a nation. I have made a few modifications to this chart, just slight differences that I have with Benware and some of the things he says. The most significant of which, he has the Mosaic Law Code there stopping at the cross. And I understand what he's saying there. It's true that it stopped in the sense of once the church came into being at Pentecost, we weren't under the law. The people of God was not subject to the law the way that the nation of Israel is. He has these other covenants all coming through the cross and showing up again in the millennial kingdom. Well, I would argue that the Mosaic Law Code does that as well. Because as you look at the character of the millennial kingdom in the prophets, particularly in the book of Ezekiel, all that stuff is it comes from the law. The temple and the sacrifices and the priest, all that's spelled out in the law. The new covenant itself talks about the law of God being written on the hearts of the people. So I think it is that law, that same law, that shows up in the millennial kingdom. And one of the arguments I would make for that comes from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Again, we looked at this before in our covenants class, but let me pick it up in verse 5. And it's describing the future restoration after they've been cast out. It says, the Lord your God will bring you, let's start in verse 4. If you're outcast or at the ends of the earth, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. The Lord your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. Moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart. Now, he hasn't done that yet in the nation of Israel. Matt, you wrote something about that, didn't you? Did you write a paper on that? You may want to make sure that we can circulate that. Because I think it's a key part of God's dealing with the nation of Israel. They were still responsible, but he'd not done the work that he's describing, that he goes on to describe later in the New Covenant, of circumcising their heart, enabling them to keep the law. Lord your God will circumscribe your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, in order that you may live. And the Lord your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies. That is, they had been inflicted on Israel, now they're going to be inflicted on their enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you. And you shall again obey the Lord and observe all his commandments, which I command you today. So the question becomes, has Israel been restored in the way that's described here in these verses that I just read? No. I mean, they've been able to come back into the land. Even in the Old Testament they did that. And they've been able to come back into the land in 1948 when they were restored to statehood in modern times. But they've not yet lived in the land the way that this passage and the latter prophets describe. So when it says, observe all his commandments, which I command you today, those are the commandments of the Mosaic covenant. Those are the commandments that were originally given in Exodus 19 through 24 and repeated in the book of Deuteronomy. All right, so that brings us, this is not quite the map, not quite yet the map that I was telling you about earlier, but this map shows the travels of Abram. Remember that Abram and his family started out here in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. They went from there, and Abram's father Terah took his family and they traveled up to Haran. Now, if they're eventually headed to the promised land, why do you think they just need to cut straight across that way?
Because it's a desert.
There's desert there. It's extremely difficult travel. They're going to be on the edge of this area, actually the edge of this area, when they make their journeys. But this is brutal to try to cross. They settle in Haran for a while. Abraham's father Terah dies, and it's from Haran that Abraham is called in Genesis 12 to go to the land that God will show him. And he does that. He travels down through the land. He goes down as far as Shechem, between Bethel and Ai. While he's there, there's a famine in the land that forces him to go down into Egypt. He stays there for a while, and then he travels back up and settles back again where he was originally, between Bethel and Ai and Shechem. So you can see through the process of that God is showing him all the land of Canaan. This is the land that God had promised to him and to his descendants. Abraham's getting a really good view of it because he travels all the way through it.
What kind of people were in there before he got there?
The Canaanites, people that were increasingly opposed to God and had their own gods. Those are the ones that are eventually going to be driven out when they come into the promised land by Joshua and his generation. All right, so now let's go back to this map. They start out, Joseph and his family, they're settled here in the land of Goshen. Remember, they were shepherds by occupation. And the Egyptians, on the one hand, the Pharaoh at the time of the Exodus was willing to let Joseph, the Pharaoh that was there when Joseph was brought into power, was willing to let Joseph and his family settle in the land of Goshen, but they didn't really intermix with them because for them, shepherds were not good people. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. It was okay for those shepherds to take care of their animals, but they gave them a separate piece of real estate to inhabit and to grow in. Well, ultimately, they multiplied to the point where they became a threat. And the Pharaoh that had been friendly toward Joseph died. And there was another Pharaoh that arose that didn't know Joseph and his family. He saw these foreigners that were within their land that were multiplying like crazy as a threat. So that's what brought on the oppression of the Israelites. They're forcing them into hard bondage and labor. Ultimately, they're delivered through the 12 plagues, through the 10 plagues. And then...
How many generations, like, why would he not know who they were? Because I would think it would be like his brother or his, like,
I don't,
or nephew, or like somebody,
yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like somebody close to him or relative.
I don't know that when it says they didn't know Joseph, I think it means, I don't know if if it means in an absolute sense, in the sense of not having any knowledge of him, but they didn't have a friendly relationship.
Like closely working with
he was,
so. But
but that Pharaoh died, and whoever the subsequent Pharaoh.
Like disposed to all the other people.
Well, they were also different, what you call dynasties. Like it wasn't always the son.
Same family dynasty, yeah. And the key point there is that just there was a change in attitude towards the Israelites being in the land. So they end up traveling out of Ramses. Or the city of Ramses was one that they helped build all the different structures in. I don't particularly like the route that's shown on this original map because it doesn't really show them crossing the Red Sea at any point. They obviously crossed at a point where they were able to walk through on dry land and the Egyptian army was drowned. It took them about 3 months as they traveled from Ramses down to Sinai. And of course, during that time, God's sustaining them. He's providing manna for them in the wilderness. They face some opposition as they get down closer to Sinai. God uses Moses and Joshua to defeat those enemies. They come down to Sinai. They spend approximately 11 months and 5 days there. This is the place at which Moses receives the law. He receives the instruction about building the tabernacle. He builds the tabernacle, he and the other Israelites. They receive instruction there in the book of Leviticus about the way the priests are to function and all the different offerings that they're to offer as part of their worship. We get to the book of Numbers, and they organize themselves in tribes around the tabernacle. Every time that they pitch camp, they're going to be organized in this way. And so Numbers sets out the journey from Sinai ultimately to the plains of Moab.
Do they know for sure where Mount Sinai is, or is it just like one of these mountains around here?
I think they aren't absolutely sure because typically when you see a map like this, they think that this is the area where it was. There may be more than one candidate for the actual mountain. So they travel from Mount Sinai first to Kadesh Barnea, as we saw earlier in the outline from the book of Numbers. That leg of the journey was marked by difficulty. As soon as they set out from Sinai, they start complaining. They start complaining about the rigor of travel through this kind of land. They start complaining about the fact that they only have manna to eat. Even Moses and Aaron, even Aaron and Miriam, as Moses' brother and sister, rebel against Moses. And so God disciplines them in each case. They get to Kadesh Barnea, and what happens at Kadesh Barnea with relation to the Promised Land? They send the 12 spies up into the heart of the Promised Land, and they come back. And what do they say?
It's bad, except for 2 people.
Okay, they don't say that the land is bad.
The land is good, but there's giants.
That's right. So they say it's everything that God's promised. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. But it's also full of giants, and we're like grasshoppers in their sight. So 10 of the spies are not at all optimistic that they can take the land. Only Joshua and Caleb say that they can. And that's the last straw for this generation. They've already complained a bunch. They've already built the golden calf even at the giving of the law. So now God causes that generation to wander for 40 years in the wilderness until they die out. Only Joshua and Caleb and their descendants are part of the original generation. After that happens, they send scouts over to this place called Punan, and what they're trying to do is get to the King's Highway that runs in a more direct route straight up into the Promised Land, but the leader of Edom won't let them do that. They have to divert down to Ezion-Geber again and skirt around the land of Edom and ultimately get up to the plains of Moab. They're up there for a period of 1 month. That's the period over which the book of Deuteronomy takes place. And that's where Moses expounds the law and gets them ready to enter into the Promised Land. So that map kind of picks up at the beginning of Exodus. Very hard. Well, I showed you Abraham's journeys, and that gives you an idea of the last parts of the book of Genesis. If anybody tries to tell you that there's a possible site on the present earth for the Garden of Eden, don't believe them. Why?
Because the flood was
Exactly. It was destroyed by flood. And if you've seen the power of water, even just of the local flood, it completely rearranges the landscape. So we don't know what the world looked like before the flood. It looked, no doubt, very different than it does today. All right, that's an overview of the Pentateuch. I forgot about this part. This is the tabernacle. This is kind of a picture based on the description of the tabernacle. You can see the priest there, the 12 stones that are part of his vestment on the front with the 12 tribes of Israel. The furniture of the tabernacle included the table of showbread and altar of incense and the 7-branched candelabra. This was the holy place, and the priests would maintain the altar of incense, they would maintain the showbread, but only the high priest, and only once a year, would go inside the Holy of Holies, the holiest place, and he would make atonement for the sins of the people once a year there. This, of course, was the Ark of the Covenant, the angels, the cherubim over the mercy seat of the covenant. This is where the Shekinah glory, either as a cloud by day or a pillar of fire by night, rested as they camped, and as that same cloud and fire would lead them as they journeyed to other places. Of course, this is the veil that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. That veil in the temple, which would later supplant the tabernacle, was what was rent in two at Christ's death. This picture is actually in that International Inductive Study Bible. It's helpful as you read the sections of the Bible that deal with the tabernacle, just to have a visual like this. The altar here is outside the tent proper, and that's where they made the sacrifices. There's also, kind of on the scene there, but it's a basin where they would wash the animals before they sacrificed them. And again, all those same elements were a part of the temple construction as well. They had multiple basins and lavers for washing, but they had the altar on the outside where the sacrifices were offered, and the inside of the temple looked very much as the inside of the tabernacle did. All right, so for next week and for the weeks after this, the best thing that you can do to prepare for the class is, at a minimum, read Ben Ware. Even if you just read Ben Ware and don't do anything else, I think you can profit from what we do from here on out in the second hour. If you have time, just skim through the book of Genesis. And you may say, well, I'm not comfortable skimming through the Bible. But all I'm saying is that you want to try to get the big picture of the flow. You can speed read it. If you've got time to read it more slowly, do that. But at a minimum, just see how those 4 events show up in the first 11 chapters, and then how the last 12 to 50 describe 4 people and the events that God is dealing with them. And then also, if you want to read Paul House, just read the section in there for Genesis for next week. He'll expound on the things that I've talked about this morning in that overview. Okay, any questions? Any other questions? All right.